and welcome back to my channel. In today's video, I'm going to be ranking the entire Paranormal Activity franchise. Now, I was inspired to do this after reviewing Undertone and comparing it positively to Paranormal Activity. Was experimenting within the field of horror, because Undertone really is sort of an experimental horror film in the vein of Paranormal Activity. The two movies really remind me of each other in the way that they tried to fundamentally change the way that we watch horror movies to rewire our brain in a really interesting way. And so as a horror fan, I really kind of got the itch to go back and watch some of these movies and to finish the franchise, as I'd only ever gotten to Paranormal Activity 4 in the past. So now, without any further ado, let's get into my thoughts on the franchise. Let's rank Paranormal Activity. Alright, starting in 7th place is Paranormal Activity, The Ghost Dimension. Now, this is the 6th entry in the franchise, and it's when the franchise really went into 3D. I thought that was going to be the big gimmick that was going to bring people into theaters. It seems like they kind of gave up on that before the film was even released, as the actual amount of theaters that they released the film into was significantly cut back from previous entries in the franchise. Now, this was the last of sort of the mainline series, and it was supposed to tie up all the loose ends.
Whatever's happening is connected to the tapes.
As someone who did kind of like the story that connected all of them, but wasn't too obsessed with it ever really in the past, watching this film really did not feel that satisfying. Even if you are a fan, I'm sure it couldn't have been that satisfying to see all these loose ends tied up. And I think that in general, this is a very visually kind of dumb movie. I mean, of course I watched it in 2D, so I'm not getting the full effect, but so much of the activity that you see as they really tried to sell it just looks stupid and is way too over the top and in your face, which is against the whole ethos of the franchise, which is supposed to be how difficult it is to find something on camera, how difficult it is to sort of prove what's going on, but also at the same time, it's slowly, there's like an accumulation of small things that build up. In this one, you just immediately see the stuff, you immediately get deep into the lore, but also there's nothing really you can do about it anyways. I found the acting to definitely be lackluster. I found the direction to be just completely dull and boring and uninspired. The house was cool, but there just wasn't really anything interesting to do with it, and I didn't care about any of these characters. I didn't find anything really particularly scary. I thought it was a visually ugly-looking movie. I thought they way over-relied on way too many jump scares and way too much just explicit stuff that they were showing, which is what I just really find frustrating about this entry. It just seems to just try and throw as many things at the wall to see what will stick in a desperate attempt to have some grand finale, as opposed to, actually caring about the fundamentals of what makes a good horror movie. This one just they completely jumped the shark, if you will. It just completely going way over the top, silly and ridiculous, in a way that completely undermines any sense of horror. And I think even they knew it. I mean, this isn't really a film that was supported a lot by the studio. The director himself, it doesn't seem like, is really, that defensive of the movie. It's just a movie that fundamentally, I think, doesn't work that well, and so that's why it's ranked at the bottom of this list. It's the worst entry in the franchise, in my opinion.
I believe she's part of a prophecy.
In 6th place, I rank Paranormal Activity Next of Kin. Now, this was a direct to Paramount Plus release that came out in 2021. It is sort of kind of not really that connected to the mainline franchise. It was attempting to almost be sort of a soft reboot for the series. It follows a documentary crew as one of the sort of people in that crew, the woman Margot, that's the main character. She's sort of reconnecting with a family that or a group of people, right, that knew her mother, her real mother. It's a group of Amish people, and so she's sort of monitoring and documenting their life while the crew slowly unravels this conspiracy. So there is some interesting ideas being thrown on here. I think this is a much better starting point than Ghost Dimension, and I think that, unfortunately though, it does suffer a lot of the same sort of problems. Again, there's just too much activity being shown. Again, they show just too much from the beginning. They don't let it slowly unravel. you also have a film that really, it's clear that they felt like they were doing something interesting visually with the movie, and I just thought it felt completely out of place with the Paranormal Activity sort of style, and that's fine if you were trying to do something different, but I just didn't think, I think when they took that chance, I admire the fact that they took a chance, but I think it fell flat. I think it feels more like some travel vlog than it feels like an actual interesting movie. It feels like the visually interesting stuff to me just really detracts from the horror. It's not really a found footage movie. Just fundamentally, there's moments where it's not even found footage at all, and it really doesn't adhere to the sort of formula of what makes found footage so interesting in the sort of scary moments that can pop up in those types of movies. It's trying to have too much narrative coherence. It's trying too much to work against the limitations that found footage sort of naturally imposes on your project because they want to do something interesting with the narrative. And I think the point is you're supposed to use your creativity to, sort of test the bounds of the limitations and to find something really interesting and unique and have a great concept to sort of establish a whole new and interesting way of doing things. But this one just feels like it's trying to be more of a standard narrative sort of film that's not found footage, but has to use the conceit only at the very bare minimum just to advance the storyline and to stay somewhat consistent with the tone of the franchise. And I felt that I hated that. Like, I wanted it to be a found footage movie. This was one of the most sort of embarrassing attempts at it because there's so much bad CGI, jump scare, stupidity, dumb characters. I don't care that you have cool visuals of the snow and the wind and the sort of lonely atmosphere. There's just not enough here. I don't care about these characters at all. There's nothing like funny going on. There's nothing fun going on at all. It's just it's a movie that feels like it's trying to show off its visual sort of flair and touches more than it's actually trying to tell a compelling narrative. And I think it's just stupid, and it does end up falling into that same sort of formula that every Paranormal Activity did anyways, except with a more bombastic finale that also felt way over the top. Why can't we go back to basics with a subtler approach? It seemed like that's what they were trying to do, but then it just all goes off the rails as we get to the third act. But I don't even think the first or second acts were that compelling to begin with, so at least we got some interesting visuals out of the project towards the end. But yeah, I didn't care about the characters. I didn't care about the lore of this sort of backstory. I thought the pseudo-documentary approach just did not work well to sort of stay within the franchise tradition of found footage. It really felt like they were just trying to make a movie that was completely different, but then they slap on the Paranormal Activity name. It's like, just make your own original project, but I guess you wouldn't get funding for that, and you wouldn't get eyeballs on your project. So I felt like this one was really disappointing. It was one that never needed to happen. There's nothing really interesting going on at all, except for some interesting visual moments, which just take you out, because you're not supposed to be looking at a Paranormal Activity movie and saying, oh, this looks pretty. And when a movie only is pretty at some times, that's not what makes a movie. Is like, oh, this has some interesting cinematography here and there. No, there's got to be something compelling underneath that actually makes you like care about watching the movie. Otherwise, why not just watch like a 4K sort of test footage, showing off like cool, beautiful images on YouTube or something? Like, what's the point of actually watching a narrative feature if it's only going to be about some cool cinematography here and there and whatever we're trying to show off? So I felt like Next of Kin was definitely a disappointment to me.
Oh my god.
Now we can move on to number 5, which I ranked Paranormal Activity 4. Now this is a movie that I saw sort of close to its original release date, so it's something that I had a little bit of familiarity going into it with. And then I didn't know at the time, obviously, who Catherine Newton was. Now I know she's a big star within the horror film industry, and it's clear when you rewatch why she became so. She is the one that's carrying this movie completely, and she does give a really good performance, in my opinion. The rest of the actors give less compelling performances. The rest of the characters I just don't really care about. It feels like a regurgitation of a lot of things that we've seen done much better. And it also is just showing way too damn much. And it is also really frustrating because in the movie, within the narrative itself, why do they put up the cameras? Oh, it's because they want to catch the activity to be able to sort of prove what's going on and to be able to find out the mystery. But no, we put the cameras up and then we forget about them. And then there's so many crazy things going on that would totally alert you to the danger, but you don't go back and watch the cameras at all for some reason, except at the very beginning when it was stuff that was sort of more subtle. And I hate that. It's like you can't cheat the audience by showing all these really over the top crazy things because you want like a true scary moment, but then at the same time you then don't have us go and see those with the characters and watch their reactions, which is what a smart horror movie would do. This is a dumb horror movie that doesn't respect or trust its audience. It just wants to show it things, and it just wants to be like a roller coaster ride, which, okay, then you better be entertaining. And it's just not, and I don't care about anybody, really. I mean, Catherine Newton, like I said, she gives a good performance. I really do think she does, and she's really young in this movie, but she really does carry the whole film on her back. But unfortunately, that can only go so far, and this is kind of just a boring, dumb movie that once again tries to connect to the lore in the most kind of dumb way, and you have Katie in there and everything, but it's dumb, and it feels like a retread of what we've already seen, and it feels like we're not really advancing the franchise in any serious way.
Front door open. Back door open.
Alex, what's going on?
Alright, so now number 4. Paranormal Activity, The Marked Ones. Now, this is one that I actually do think is a pretty good movie. Like, I definitely think it's at least decent, and I think maybe the direction of Christopher Landon is a major reason why, but I also think the actors themselves are really compelling. I think it's an enormously funny movie, which I know Landon likes to do that with his films. He likes to have humor in them, and this one definitely, especially in the first half, is super, super funny. And I think that really helps us to care about these characters who feel like real people, and I do think that they have really compelling chemistry on screen. It really does feel like it is kind of like Next of Kin in a way where it does feel like it's trying to be sort of a standard narrative feature, but it's able to smartly use the found footage anyways and incorporate it in a way that is intelligent and isn't just trying to like get away with doing the bare minimum to sort of fit within the rigid construct of a found footage movie. This one is having a compelling reason for why the camera should continue to be going for the most part. At the same time, it's having really interesting characters and having an actual like beginning, middle, and end that actually feels like it's coherent, and it actually feels like a real movie in a lot of ways. It feels like this weird superhero origin story at the beginning, and then it slowly morphs into this weird horror thing that's like body horror and all this stuff that's really compelling and like a possession tale. And that stuff's great, and I love those types of genres being fused together in a found footage horror movie, and it really does feel like an original film. And it's not just because they're exploring Latino culture, but it's also because, in general, it does feel like a thing that is trying to sort of test the bounds of what we've seen before. It's not just someone putting cameras in their house to then review the footage. This is sort of like a vlog of their everyday life or like a personal home video, and it really does feel like it is just these random sort of teenagers in the in-between times in their life. So I think that we have some really interesting characters here. We have some really interesting set pieces and moments. We have some actually genuinely scary moments. And we also have just hilariously funny elements in this plot. There's just, like, when they shoot the witches with the shotguns, that's amazing. When you have the guy falling backwards, that is one of the funniest moments in the entire franchise.
2, 3, go!
And I really think that that is something that helps carry this movie, is that we care about the characters. It's super funny, but then when it needs to, it ratchets up the scares. Now, there is some elements that I don't think work as well. I do think at times the over-the-top horror as we get into the second half maybe detracts a little bit from it. I think The lore they're trying to connect, and I think they do it in one of the more interesting ways in the franchise. But it also can take away a little bit of it from at times because it just feels almost too fan servicey with so many recurring locations being brought back and characters being brought back. I think they could have cut back on a little bit of that. But at the end of the day, I do think that they had a compelling sort of reason to bring back all that franchise lore, and they did something really interesting with it in the end, and I do appreciate that. So, Paranormal Activity, the marked ones, is definitely a good movie. It has some flaws, but for the most part, this is what you would want out of a sort of fifth entry in the franchise, being able to push it in new directions and really make a compelling, good movie out in a way that you would not expect to happen, right? This was something that was kind of supposedly, I guess it was marketed as more of like a spin-off, and then they go and they connect it so many ways. But I do think that was the right approach, is to not try too much to continue to find very, very like strenuous connections to the original people and just sort of do an interesting story within the world. I think that's a much smarter approach. So I think Paranormal Activity, the marked ones, yeah, I put it at fourth, and this is sort of the start of the good movies in the franchise. All right, number three is Paranormal Activity 2. Now, this is one that I watched when I was a little kid. So, this is one that I have some nostalgia for, as well as basically the first three, and I guess even the fourth one. I don't remember exactly when that came out, but I watched them all at a very young age, even before I really got obsessed with horror movies. And Paranormal Activity 2, in my opinion, is a very solid sequel. It found a really good hook to be able to sort of continue the narrative. There's some really great jump scares and scary moments in general. I think the ending was really satisfying. I think that it's a smart sort of evolution of the concept. So many sequels that are rushed in the way that Paranormal Activity 2 were end up not being that interesting, but I think the kind of words that I would use is just like smart, intelligent, things like that. That is what it feels like when you're watching it, is that they knew what they were doing and that this wasn't just a cash grab. I think the performances were good. I think characters, okay, maybe we don't care about all of them. Like the dad is just kind of annoying, but I think that for the most part, it feels like a real family. There is a verisimilitude that you sort of kind of connect with in these early entries in the franchise because it wasn't too over the top. Yes, there's scary moments. Yes, there's like pots and pans flying all over and cupboards opening and doors slamming and people being dragged down the stairs and all these sort of over the top moments, but they're done in a much subtler way and with less sort of CGI and visual effect trickery. It's sort of just kind of back to basics horror movies, which I just love that. And I love these early entries that they're not going way over the top. And I love that, you do feel the stress of the sort of accumulation of all these little small things that build up to a sort of crescendo of a finale. It all kind of builds to this sort of crazy ending that is so like satisfying and fun to watch and scary. And so I think Paranormal Activity 2 is just a really smart, well done horror movie. And while it doesn't necessarily push things too far, and so it's kind of does feel in some ways like a retread of the original. I think there's enough new things and enough pushing of the envelope that it is something that is worth watching and is a worthwhile sequel to the classic original.
By itself.
All right, moving on to number two. I have the original Paranormal Activity, the one that started it all, the one that sort of defined a new era in horror movies, one that was sort of, it beat the Saw movies at the box office. This was a real sort of touchstone for Jason Blum and his whole company, and sort of the resurgence of a different type of horror movie. Obviously, you had so many indie found footage horror movies that sort of were spawned out of the success of this one, but also just in general, sort of a back to basics, spooky haunted house sort of style horror movie. That Insidious, The Conjuring, like those types of movies made by sort of Jason Blum and James Wan and all these people, that sort of became one of the dominant modes of the next decade or so of horror movies. And I think this one, even though it was so low budget and it was such a small cast and crew in one location, I think that's what makes it so satisfying and so interesting to watch is that they were really pushing themselves, and you have really talented people all sort of working against the clock of this sort of very low budget atmosphere of a filmmaking endeavor. And I think that that works really well in the horror of this because it's subtler, it's scarier because it feels more realistic. You have actual like I think the acting really helps feel like real humans. And I love that there's just this sort of subtle menace that's just constantly, going at these characters and slowly unraveling them. And Mika is a complete jerk in this, and that I think does detract a little bit from my enjoyment. I think they didn't need to make him such a doubter, but at the end of the day, that is sort of the concept of this movie, right? Is one of them is doubting and wants to show what's really going on, and then even he gets converted to what's going on. And I think there's just so much subtle horror at work. And it's the type of movie where you're constantly watching the screen and you're constantly looking into the darkness and the shadows, looking for anything. And I think that that's a really smart way of activating the imagination. I think Paranormal Activity is one of those horror movies that really proves this sort of idea of your imagination can conjure up scarier things than we can show you. And I don't always agree with that as a philosophy. I think that there's so many horror movies that do show you really cool and interesting stuff, but I do think it can work when successfully done. And I think Paranormal Activity rewires your brain in such a way where you are sort of filling in the blanks in a really terrifying way. And I think that's just such a smart filmmaking sort of philosophy to use on a very low budget when you can't afford to show exactly what you would like to show. So yeah, obviously sort of a genius marketing campaign that undergirded the success of this film. There was so many reshoots and things, and it was a really low budget film with a super small like skeleton crew. And I think that the fact that it sort of helped redefine the entire face of horror is something that is kind of underappreciated, I think, by horror fans nowadays. I think a lot of people don't really like the Paranormal Activity movies, but I really love them because when done well, I think they are super unsettling, and I'm constantly looking in the shadows, and I just love that. And I think there's too few horror movies that really give me the exact type of feeling I get when I watch one of these movies. And so I think that there's a lot to be said for being the first one to do it, and to do it in such a satisfying way that it made all the sequels possible and the whole sort of shift to the genre that was necessary so it didn't get stale with too much sort of over-the-top splatter horror movies. So I really do sort of commend this movie. I really love the ending. There's just so much unsettling stuff going on. And when I compare Undertone to Paranormal Activity, that's high praise coming from me. It's not sort of diminishing the film in any way.
There's footsteps in, but there's no footsteps out.
Oh God. Oh my God.
All right, so that leaves the obvious one here for number one, the last one left. Number one is Paranormal Activity 3. This one is a prequel following the young girls from the sisters from the first and second movie, Christy and Katie, and now their kids. This is back in the 1980s. And this movie had so many smart innovations, and it's so captivating, and it's really pushing things just enough before you got to way over the top in the further sequels, right, of 4 and Ghost Dimension and things like that. Before you went way too ridiculously over the top, you had just the right mixture here that made this movie one that, in my opinion, tops the original and is just a really good horror movie in its own right and is definitely underrated. So I think what I really like about this movie is there was just some small little tweaks that really pay off. I think the most obvious innovation that was so smart and made everything so scary, and it just feels like it's such an obvious evolution of the concept of the original movie, is the fan and using it to sort of pan back and forth between the sort of the kitchen and the living room. I just think that's or I guess the kitchen and the dining room rather. I mean, it's kind of an open concept house, but it's such a smart way of doing found footage, and they use it to such great effect. I mean, you have the babysitter scene with the sheet and then the disappearing ghost underneath it. So many little small moments too that are really unsettling. Now, I recently, when I was rewatching it, I saw the director's cut, so there was some extended moments. So I saw like there was this scene where the little girl goes up on the railing and jumps, and Toby the ghost catches her, and I just think that little scene. I know that obviously I understand why they would cut it from the original sort of version of the movie, but it's so unsettling, and it's just got such a creepy small little moment. It's not really one that is you would think is going to be like one of the scariest moments because it's such a small little thing. But you're just on edge and you're so tense because you're like, if she falls like that, she's going to get really hurt. And then all of a sudden, it just sort of quietly, she gets caught by Toby and she runs up to do it again. And I just think that's so unsettling. And then the Bloody Mary scene, when I was a kid watching this movie with my brother, I mean, the Bloody Mary scene, this is something that me and him did. And it was a really sort of unsettling sort of verisimilitude that you're adding into the narrative when it's something that kids like to do on their own. And then you're representing that. And then something actually spooky happens. And then they do it again later, and it continues to ratchet up everything keeps getting ratcheted up, and then the parents slowly start to unravel as well. And so even when the adults start to sort of unravel, the ones that were very suspicious of this at the beginning, I guess the husband was always kind of on board with maybe this being true, but he starts to really understand the sort of conspiracy that is undergirding everything that's happening. And I think that their unraveling is really scary. And I think just these small little moments with the daughters and Toby and everything, it's so smart and effective. And I also like that he goes back and watches the footage and is like, whoa, what's going on there? I think he could have done more of that and would have found out quicker. And I think that's one of my critiques of this movie. And one of the things that I hated about Paranormal Activity 4 is you really, if you're going to show something that just completely proves the paranormal activity, you better be watching it back. But yeah, I just think this is a movie that really sort of pushed the envelope in a lot of smart, small ways. And I think the children actresses that were in this both really did a good, compelling job and made us care about these characters. And both of the adult sort of people in the narrative were both nice people that cared about their kids, and they weren't just randomly jerks for no reason, and they loved each other, and they were trying to figure out a way to solve these problems. Of course, the mom is like thinking that it's just all in their head, but then when it happens to her, she immediately sort of shifts gears. But she's never as sort of ridiculous and over the top mean as Mika or some of the other characters in the first two movies. So I really like these characters. I care about them. I care about this family. Even though I know that something bad is going to happen, I still am cheering and hoping that something not so bad is going to happen. And that's something that I think can sometimes be bad about a series, is when every single one ends poorly. But that's kind of inevitable in a prequel. But I think that they built up to it in a really smart way. And the ending is really scary with all the cult stuff and the witch stuff. And it does feel kind of like Hereditary before Hereditary, right? And so I think it was sort of touching on a lot of things that became really big themes in the horror sort of film landscape in the years following. So I think it's kind of a secretly influential little horror movie. And so I love that for it too, just as far as its thematic content and the backstory and so many interesting things going on here. So yeah, I think there's just so much smart filmmaking going on here. I think this is a really good horror movie just on its own. And then as a found footage, I mean, found footage horror movies are so rarely good that this one being as good as it is like just amazing. And it makes it one of the best found footage horror movies of all time just on that alone. So I definitely think this is a sort of an underrated, underappreciated movie. It is definitely, in my opinion, the best of the franchise. I next want to just talk about this documentary that I watched after I watched the series, And I definitely think this is one that I would recommend to any fan of these movies. It's called Unknown Dimension, the story of paranormal activity, and it really gives a cool behind the scenes look at the entire franchise up into sort of the ghost dimension. It gives a little bit of a preview of Next of Kin, but that movie hadn't come out yet, so they couldn't really get a behind the scenes look on that movie. Now, this is a documentary that is actually really compelling, and it's actually honest about the series. It's not one that sugarcoats everything. It talks about the problems with the filmmaking. It has people admitting that they think the fourth movie and the sixth movie are both really poorly done, and I think that is interesting to sort of get an honest observation from people like Jason Blum, who aren't just trying to sugarcoat everything. They're talking about a lot of the problems with the behind the scenes production on these movies and the sort of the kind of the miracle of how they even came to be in the first place. So yeah, this is just a really sort of fun documentary to watch. It's one that definitely gives you a lot of great behind the scenes information and commentary on these movies. At times, some of the actors can be really in sort of electronic press kit mode, which I think is a bit disappointing. I mean, you saw this was really apparent with some of the younger actors, right? That they were interviewing for movies like Paranormal Activity 4 and stuff like that. I just kind of found that disappointing. I don't want to just hear how amazing it was and all these sort of practiced PR sort of lines. Like, I just want the actual honest truth of what it was really like. And I think Katie and Mika did a good job of sort of really sort of telling you what it was like. And of course, they sort of had a positive lens on everything, but I think that's also partly due to the overwhelming success that the film did find for them. That really helped change their life. And so some of these other actors, it was just sort of a studio project they worked on. So of course they're just going to kind of give your standard sort of safe answers, which I think was a bit disappointing. But I think a lot of the other interesting people that were there, the studio executives, the sort of creatives behind these projects, actually gave very truthful answers, and they weren't being too defensive about the movies, which I found really refreshing. And I think it's one that if you are a fan of the franchise, you will appreciate for sure. And even if you're just a fan of horror filmmaking in general and you want to sort of hear about how these kind of movies get made, I think it's a really inspirational story, especially that first movie, how it was able to get the wide release it eventually did and have the influence and inspiration it was able to create within the horror genre. It's definitely something that I found very inspirational. One that really inspires me to continue to try and find avenues to make my own horror movie. And so I definitely think that I would recommend Unknown Dimension. I think it's a really good documentary. All right, so that's all. If you're also a fan of Paranormal Activity, let me know down in the comments section below what your ranking is. I would love to hear from you. And so that's all for today's video. Thank you all so much for watching. I'll see you next time.